Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Noah stood in the shadowed corner of the Abbott living room long after the door had closed behind him, the weight of the truth pressing so hard on his chest that each breath felt borrowed, stolen from a future he knew would be forever altered the moment he spoke, and Jack sensed it immediately, the way a man senses an approaching storm not by sight but by the pressure shift in the air, while Kyle, restless and sharp-eyed, paced near the fireplace, irritation simmering beneath his impatience. Because Noah had called them there with a voice that trembled just enough to signal catastrophe, and when Noah finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, not with fresh tears but with the raw, hollow look of someone who had cried until nothing was left, and he said Allie's name like a prayer and a curse intertwined, and Jack's heart clenched because in that single utterance he heard finality, the kind that does not ask questions but answers them, and Noah confessed then, in a voice that cracked but did not break, that Allie was dead, not missing, not hiding, not starting a new life somewhere far away as so many had desperately hoped, but murdered, the word landing like a gunshot in the room, echoing off the walls and into Jack's bones while Kyle froze mid-step, the color draining from his face as if the world itself had tilted and spilled all its light onto the floor, and Noah went on, because once the first truth escaped there was no stopping the flood, explaining that he had known for weeks, that the knowledge had been eating him alive, that every smile he'd forced, every lie he'd told about optimism and patience, had been built on the rot of silence, and Jack demanded to know why, his voice tight with a mixture of rage and grief, why Noah would keep something so devastating hidden, and Noah answered with brutal honesty, saying fear, guilt, and misplaced loyalty had chained his tongue, because the killer was not some faceless monster lurking in the dark but someone woven into their lives, someone who sat at their tables, shook their hands, shared their secrets, and Kyle whispered Allie's name again as if repetition might summon her back, his mind racing through memories, her laugh, her stubborn courage, the way she believed in people even when they didn't deserve it, and Noah's voice shook harder now as he described the night it happened, the argument that spiraled out of control, the way Allie had refused to back down, how she had threatened to expose the truth about a crime that predated her death, a crime that would have destroyed a powerful man, and Jack felt a cold realization creep in, because power always left fingerprints even when it tried to hide them, and Noah finally said the name he had been choking on, revealing that the killer was Victor, the revelation slicing through the room with surgical cruelty, and Kyle staggered backward as if physically struck, his mind rejecting the words even as his gut recognized their terrible plausibility, because Victor's shadow loomed over Genoa City like an unmovable monument, and Jack's jaw tightened, decades of rivalry, grudging respect, and buried hatred igniting all at once, and Noah explained that Victor hadn't intended to kill Allie, that it had been meant as intimidation, a warning delivered through one of his trusted operatives, but things had gone wrong, a struggle, a fall, a fatal blow, and then a cover-up so meticulous it had fooled even the best investigators, and Jack felt something inside him fracture because accidental or not, blood was blood, and Victor had crossed a line that could never be erased, and Kyle erupted then, rage pouring out of him in raw, jagged bursts, accusing Noah of protecting a murderer, of choosing fear over justice, of stealing weeks of mourning from a family that deserved the truth, and Noah didn't defend himself, he absorbed the blows, saying he'd been threatened, that Victor had made it clear anyone who spoke would lose everything, their careers, their families, their lives if necessary, and Jack understood that threat all too well, understanding how Victor operated, how he weaponized loyalty and fear with equal precision, and yet understanding did nothing to dull the fury burning in his chest, because this wasn't business, this wasn't rivalry, this was a young woman murdered for daring to tell the truth, and as Noah spoke of the evidence he'd secretly gathered, the messages Allie had sent him, the audio recording she'd made the night she died, the financial trails that led back to Newman Enterprises, Jack's mind shifted into strategy even as his heart bled, because grief without action was surrender, and surrender was something he had never learned to accept, and Kyle, pacing again now, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, demanded to know where Allie's body was, and Noah's voice dropped to a whisper as he revealed it had been moved, hidden on land controlled by a shell company linked to Victor, a final insult meant to ensure she would never be found, never mourned properly, never avenged, and the room fell silent except for the sound of Jack's controlled breathing, because he knew this truth would ignite a war that would consume everyone it touched. And Noah looked at both men then, eyes pleading not for forgiveness but for resolve, saying he couldn't carry this alone anymore. That Allie deserved justice even if it cost them everything, and Jack placed a steadying hand on Noah's shoulder, the gesture heavy with unspoken promises, while Kyle nodded slowly, the shock giving way to a lethal clarity, because grief had sharpened into purpose, and Jack spoke at last, his voice low and unwavering, promising that Victor Newman would answer for what he'd done, that no amount of power would shield him from the consequences of murder. And as the three men stood there bound by a terrible truth, the future of Genoa City shifted on its axis, alliances ready to fracture, secrets poised to explode, because Noah's confession was not just the end of Allie's story but the beginning of a reckoning that would leave no one untouched. The silence that followed Jack's vow did not bring peace but rather a deeper, more ominous tension, as though the walls themselves were listening, storing the words for the inevitable explosion to come, and Noah exhaled shakily, realizing that once spoken, the truth could never be reclaimed, that it would ripple outward through Genoa City like a seismic shock, collapsing facades and exposing fault lines long hidden beneath wealth and influence. And Jack, ever the tactician even in grief, began asking precise questions, his voice calm in a way that frightened Kyle more than shouting ever could, because it meant his father was already planning a war, asking Noah exactly what proof he possessed, how solid it was, who else might know, and Noah revealed everything then, leaving nothing unsaid, describing how Allie had come to him terrified but determined, how she had uncovered evidence tying Victor to a years-old corporate sabotage that had ruined lives and driven one man to suicide, how Victor's fixer had confronted her, how Victor himself had made the call that sealed her fate, and Kyle's stomach twisted with every detail, each word sharpening his grief into something dangerously focused, because this was no longer abstract evil but a sequence of choices made by a man who believed himself untouchable. And Noah admitted that after Allie's death he'd been forced to play along, to act as though hope still existed, to smile in public while privately being fed instructions and warnings, because Victor wanted to control the narrative until the last possible moment, and Jack recognized the tactic immediately, the slow suffocation of truth until resistance collapsed under exhaustion, and he swore silently that this time it would fail, and Kyle asked the question he'd been avoiding, his voice barely steady, asking whether Victor knew Noah was here now, confessing everything, and Noah said no, not yet, but that the window was small, because Victor always sensed betrayal. Eventually, and Jack nodded, already mapping timelines in his mind, knowing they had hours at best before the net tightened, and he made a decision then, one that would irrevocably alter his relationship with Victor and likely cost him more than he could measure, instructing Noah to turn over every scrap of evidence immediately and to prepare to go into hiding if necessary, because the truth was only powerful if it survived long enough to be heard, and Kyle bristled at the idea of retreat, his anger demanding confrontation, but Jack silenced him with a look, reminding him that this wasn't about vengeance in the dark but justice in the light, and that to defeat Victor Newman they would need more than rage, they would need patience, allies, and impeccable timing. And Kyle swallowed hard, the weight of leadership pressing down on him as he realized this fight would demand maturity forged in loss, and Noah, visibly relieved to no longer be alone, agreed to do whatever was required. Confessing that the guilt of silence had been destroying him, that every day he'd woken up expecting Allie to walk through the door and forgive him, and Jack told him gently but firmly that forgiveness would come later, that right now their duty was to ensure her death meant something, and as they spoke, the larger implications began to unfold, because exposing Victor would not only bring justice for Allie but would unravel decades of fear-based loyalty, potentially freeing others who had been coerced into silence, and Jack understood that this was bigger than any personal feud, that it was an opportunity to change the balance of power in Genoa City permanently, and Kyle, thinking of the people Victor had crushed along the way, felt a grim sense of resolve settle into his bones, realizing that Allie's courage might finally succeed where so many others had failed, and yet beneath the resolve lay fear, because Victor would not fall quietly, and Noah confirmed that fear by revealing Victor's contingency plans, the offshore accounts, the legal shields, the loyalists embedded in law enforcement and media, all designed to muddy the waters and discredit anyone who spoke out, and Jack listened intently, absorbing every detail, because he knew that dismantling Victor's empire would require precision, not brute force, and he began outlining the first steps, suggesting they loop in trusted legal counsel, someone untainted by Newman influence, and discreetly notify federal authorities with jurisdiction beyond local reach, because this could not be handled quietly within Genoa City, not when Victor's influence ran so deep, and Kyle agreed, already reaching for his phone before stopping himself, realizing that even digital communication could be monitored, and Noah nodded, admitting that Victor's surveillance network was extensive, that nothing had been left to chance. And the irony struck them all then, that Victor's obsession with control might ultimately be his undoing, because the sheer complexity of his web increased the likelihood of exposure, and Jack said quietly that they would use Victor's own paranoia against him, feeding him just enough misinformation to make him hesitate, to buy time, and Kyle felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that comes when grief crystallizes into purpose, and he thought of Allie not as a victim but as the catalyst for something monumental. And as the night deepened outside the Abbott house, the three men forged an unspoken pact, bound not by blood alone but by truth, and Noah asked one last question, his voice fragile, asking what would happen when Victor denied everything, when he painted Allie as reckless, unstable, or complicit in her own demise, and Jack answered without hesitation, saying they would not let her be erased again, that they would tell her story in full, with compassion and evidence, ensuring that her humanity could not be buried alongside her body, and Kyle added that they would find her remains, bring her home, give her the dignity Victor had tried to steal, and Noah's eyes filled with tears then, not just of sorrow but of gratitude, because for the first time since Allie's death he felt the weight lifting slightly, replaced by the knowledge that he had finally chosen the right side, and as the conversation turned toward the risks ahead, the sacrifices they would inevitably face, Jack acknowledged that this could cost him Jabot, his reputation, even his freedom. If Victor struck back hard enough, but he said some lines could not remain uncrossed without consequence, and murder was one of them, and Kyle realized that this was the true inheritance his father was passing on, not wealth or power but the courage to stand against tyranny no matter the cost, and Noah, drawing strength from their resolve, vowed to testify, to stand in open court and say Victor Newman's name even if it made him a target for the rest of his life, and Jack clasped his shoulder. Again, a gesture of solidarity that carried the weight of shared danger, and as dawn began to creep toward the horizon, the Abbott house transformed from a place of mourning into a command center for justice, the air charged with determination and fear in equal measure, because they all knew the road ahead would be brutal, that Victor would strike back with everything he had, but they also knew something fundamental had shifted, because the truth was no longer buried in the dark, it was alive, breathing, and ready to fight back, and somewhere beyond the walls of power and secrecy, Allie's story was finally moving toward the reckoning she had died trying to bring about. As the first pale light of morning filtered through the windows, it felt less like dawn and more like a warning, a reminder that time was no longer their ally, and Jack straightened his jacket as if armor could be summoned through habit alone, his mind already several steps ahead, anticipating Victor's countermoves before they were even made, while Kyle stood near the window, watching the quiet street with the wary intensity of someone who knew that calm was only temporary, and Noah sat heavily on the edge of the sofa, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline, because confession did not erase grief, it only stripped away the numbness that had protected him from it, and Jack broke the silence by stating the obvious truth they were all circling, that once this went public there would be no halfway outcome, that Victor would either be exposed beyond recovery or would destroy anyone who tried, and Kyle turned from the window then, his voice low but steady, saying that backing down was no longer an option, not after Allie, not after everything they now knew, and Noah nodded, agreeing, admitting that even fear had lost its power over him because living with silence had been worse than any threat Victor could make, and Jack studied the two younger men, seeing not recklessness but resolve, and he felt a surge of grim pride tempered by dread, because leadership meant guiding others into danger while pretending you knew exactly how it would end, and he laid out the next phase carefully, explaining that before confronting authorities they would secure duplicates of all evidence, store them in multiple locations, and ensure that if anything happened to one of them the truth would still surface, because Victor's greatest weapon had always been erasure, and Kyle volunteered immediately, saying he would handle the off-site storage personally, refusing to delegate something so critical, and Jack allowed it, recognizing that Kyle needed action as much as strategy to survive. The weight of his grief, and Noah offered to contact one person Victor didn't control, a journalist who had once been blacklisted for refusing to bury a Newman scandal, someone who understood the cost of truth and might be willing to pay it again, and Jack considered it, then agreed, knowing that public pressure could become a shield if timed correctly, and as plans solidified, the emotional undercurrent surged again, because beneath every logistical detail lay the simple, unbearable fact that Allie was gone, and Kyle finally allowed himself to speak of her not as evidence or catalyst but as a person, recalling how she used to challenge him, how she never accepted easy answers, how she believed that even the most powerful people should be accountable, and his voice broke then, just once, before he steadied it, and Jack placed a hand on his son's back, a rare gesture of comfort that said what words could not, that this pain was shared, and Noah listened, tears slipping silently down his face, because hearing Allie remembered with such clarity felt like both a wound and a balm, and he promised again that her voice would not be lost, that every choice he made from now on would honor her courage, and the room felt heavier for that vow, because it bound them not just to justice but to memory, and Jack warned them that Victor would likely strike first by discrediting Noah, framing him as unstable, jealous, or complicit, and Noah accepted that inevitability, saying he was ready to be painted as a villain if it meant the truth survived, and Kyle bristled at the idea of Noah being sacrificed, but Jack reminded him that Victor always attacked credibility before facts, and that they would counter with transparency and corroboration, and as the morning wore on, the house began to stir with distant sounds of life continuing outside their crisis, a cruel reminder that the world did not stop for grief, and Jack knew that once they stepped out that door, they would be stepping onto a battlefield where appearances mattered as much as evidence, and he instructed them to act normal, to avoid drawing attention until the moment was right, because Victor thrived on panic, and denying him that would be their first small victory, and Kyle laughed bitterly at the word, normal, but nodded anyway, understanding the necessity, and Noah stood then, shoulders squared, looking more determined than Jack had ever seen him, and said that for the first time since Allie's death he felt like he was finally moving forward instead of circling the same nightmare, and Jack replied that justice was rarely clean or comforting, but it was movement, and sometimes that was enough to keep going, and as they prepared to separate and begin their respective tasks, Jack gathered them both, his voice firm and deliberate, saying that whatever happened next, they would face it together, that Victor Newman had ruled through isolation and fear for too long, and that unity was the one thing he could not easily crush, and Kyle felt a strange surge of hope then, fragile but real, because even if the cost ahead was devastating, the truth had already changed them, had stripped away illusions and replaced them with something harder and more honest, and Noah took a final look around the room, imprinting the moment into his memory, because he knew this was the last quiet breath before the storm, and as they stepped forward into the uncertain day, bound by grief, truth, and resolve, the legacy of Allie's courage moved with them, no longer silenced, no longer hidden, but alive in every step toward the reckoning that Genoa City could no longer escape. The moment they finally stepped outside, the air felt sharper, as though the city itself sensed the shift and was holding its breath, and Jack paused on the threshold, locking the door behind them with deliberate care, not because he believed a lock could stop Victor Newman, but because ritual mattered when chaos loomed, grounding them in small certainties, and Kyle scanned the street instinctively, his eyes catching on every passing car, every pedestrian who lingered too long, aware now that paranoia was not weakness but survival, and Noah drew his coat tighter around himself, feeling exposed despite the anonymity of the morning crowd, because truth had a way of making even familiar places feel hostile, and Jack reminded them quietly that fear was exactly what Victor would expect, that composure would be their first act of defiance, and Kyle nodded, forcing his shoulders to relax even as his pulse raced, and as they parted ways, each heading toward their assigned tasks, there was no dramatic farewell, no speeches or promises, only brief looks that carried the weight of everything unsaid, because they all understood that the next time they stood together it might be under far harsher circumstances, and as Jack walked toward his car, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, acknowledging the enormity of what lay ahead, The possibility that he might lose not just power or reputation but the fragile peace he had fought so hard to build, yet even in that acknowledgement there was no regret, because some truths demanded to be spoken regardless of consequence, and Kyle, driving away in the opposite direction, felt the grief settle into a quieter, steadier ache, no longer chaotic but focused, fueling his determination to see this through to the end, and Noah, moving through the city with purpose, carried with him both terror and relief, knowing that while danger still lurked in every shadow, the heaviest burden he had carried, the burden of silence, had finally been laid down, and somewhere beyond the reach of Victor's influence, beyond fear and manipulation, the truth was already moving, unstoppable now, toward the reckoning that would either shatter Genoa City's illusions forever or finally, at long last, set it free.